Hi guys, welcome to Mendoza Makes. I'm Michelle Mendoza and today I'm going to show you how to read a recipe. So step number one in reading a recipe is literally that. Just read it. Read the ingredients and all of the directions. If you're particularly lazy like I am, skimming it is perfectly fine, but what you're looking for in this process is, are there any techniques that you don't know? Because then you're gonna have to go Google them and figure out how to do that thing. Like if you don't know how to braise meat and that's called for in the recipe, you're gonna have to go look up how to do that before you start making it. Otherwise you won't know what you're doing. Secondly, you're looking for any equipment that's called for in the recipe to make it that you might not have, or you might have to get creative and figure out another way to use something you do have. Like, for example, if you're making something that the recipe calls for using a food processor and you don't have a food processor, maybe you can get around it by using a blender instead. So maybe a little bit of research might be required for that. And then lastly, just make sure that you have all of the ingredients that are called for in the recipe, or any substitutions that you might be making for foods that you don't like or you're allergic to, and you're substituting them out for something else or removing them from the recipe altogether. First step, read through the recipe or at least skim it for techniques that you don't know, ingredients that you need, and equipment that you need. That's step one. Step two would be to make sure that you can measure your ingredients accurately. So something that I didn't know until just a little while ago, and something I don't really hear people talking about very much, is that these scoops are meant for dry ingredient measuring. Also, things like sauces, like if you're measuring mayonnaise or honey, things like that, basically just think of these as anything that you can level off. So I usually use a knife or an offset spatula. You can scoop in the ingredient you're using, like flour, sugar, like I said, mayonnaise, stuff like that, and then level it off with the flat edge of a knife or an offset spatula, depending on what you have. This is meant for measuring liquid ingredients or anything that levels off itself. As I mentioned in the previous video on how to find recipes, baking and cooking are a little bit different, where a lot of baking recipes will call for weight measurements, so you'll need a scale. I'll put a link to this one that I have here. I use it all the time. It was 10 bucks on Amazon, super cheap. If you have never used a scale before, I'll just show you really quickly. So all you're gonna do is turn your scale on and set to grams because I was making bread, and then put your container, whatever you're going to use, just say we're using this one, and see it registers the weight down here. But I don't want the weight of the container, I just want what's inside. So I'm going to just tar it out and it's to 0. So now whatever I put in here, it will tell me the measurement of what's in here. So I'll know how much flour I put in there, how much water, salt, etc. You get the idea. If I'm mixing a bunch of things, like say I'm doing some flour, some sugar, some salt, like my dry ingredients, after I add each ingredient, I'll tar it out again so that it's giving me only the measurement of whatever I'm adding and not what's already in here. The third thing to focus on when reading a recipe accurately is the comma placement. That seems really funny and like a grammar thing, but it actually really does matter. It kind of tells you the order of operations, what you should do first. Should you measure it first and then melt it, dice it, do whatever it wants you to do with it? Or should you dice it first and then measure? So for example, this recipe for chocolate crinkles, you can tell I like it, get a pretty little smiley face. It says 4 ounces unsweetened baking chocolate, comma, creamer, melted and cooled. So I'm going to measure out 4 ounces before you melt it and cool it. That tells me the order of operations to do this. If I melted it first and then measured, I might have too much and I might have too little, and it won't be the correct ratio that the recipe calls for. Another good example is this recipe for salsa that has 3 large tomatoes, comma, seeded, comma, chopped. That's telling me take the 3 large tomatoes, de-seed them, then chop them. Same thing with the green bell pepper, one of them, chop it. It's telling me the order to do things in. Measure, then chop. Now that is because it's calling for whole ingredients. If it wasn't using all of the tomato, you probably would dice it first and then measure. Now to those of you out there thinking it doesn't really matter, I ask you this. If a recipe calls for a third a cup of onion, let's say, you're trying to measure a third a cup of a whole onion before you dice it, how are you doing this? You really have to dice the onion and then measure a third of a cup. I can't measure a third of a cup of this. It does not fit. No. Another example would be this recipe that calls for 2 large onions, comma, sliced. So you're taking the measurement of 2 large onions first and then slicing them. Pretty simple. That's it. As long as you know all of the techniques and you pay attention to the placement of the commas and how you're measuring your ingredients, easy peasy. Done. Purposefully looking for recipes that have techniques that you are not familiar with is a really good way to teach yourself those techniques. You'll have to Google them or YouTube them to teach yourself, but practicing with recipes is a really good way to do that. Next week, we'll talk more about how to use a recipe as a teaching tool to teach yourself how to use those techniques and how to cook without a recipe. If you like this video or you learned something, give it a like. If you'd like to learn more, subscribe to my channel. I upload videos every Friday. Thank you for watching and see you next time. Bye.